So the most detailed, the most intimate, documented history about the Tongan people and the Tongan culture, and it's basically the Tongan story, is found in the William Mariner story. And the book is called Tonga Islands. And Tonga Islands itself was written by John Martin, who is a writer of books of savage nations, or savage, basically primitive nations. And so when he heard William Mariner's story, all the stories that he made up or created, he basically said, there's no way I could have thought this up on my own. He had to have heard William Mariner's experiences, and also those of his friends, for him to understand what truly a savage nation would be like if all they had was their own government and their own society of their own, right? And so he wrote the book just based on William Mariner's story first. And then he finds out that there's a French translation in Paris of the book. They copied it into French, and then he heard about that. Then he thought he'll come out with a second edition, which is the edition I have with the witnesses that were actually with him. So the first book was of just him. The second one was with him and his 3 friends, all of the same age, 15 years old. So William Mariner, a 15-year-old kid, educated in England, and these are all English young men, educated there, and then he went on to become an actual mariner, which was basically a sailor or whatever. And because of his level of education, they put him in the clerk's position. He was a clerk on the ship, on the Port-au-Prince. The Port-au-Prince was a ship that actually belonged to the French in the 1700s, and the English took it over sometime around there, and then it fell into the hands of basically William Mariner's dad. One of William Mariner's friends, because we got to remember, all these guys were kids, right? William Mariner himself was 15. There's guys his age that were getting onto ships and picking up occupations on ships, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And so Will Mariner and 3 other friends of his age group jumped on, and they became that, either a hand or, a clerk, or, in William Mariner's case, he was a clerk because he was educated. He knew how to read, he knew how to write, he knew how to keep record, and that's what his duty was on the ship. Jeremiah Higgins, basically a hand on it, and he himself was 15 years old. So we're talking about kids sailing, on the ships, doing, basically being hands. Jeremiah Higgins escaped from Tonga, and we're going to call it escape because when they first got there, they were actually, the ship itself, a lot of them were slaughtered, and the young guys were kept and just distributed into society among different, families, and they became part of that family. But he escaped 13 months prior to William Mariner actually leaving. So William Mariner was there for almost 4 years, and a year and a half before that, Jeremiah Higgins leaves. We get the testimony of Jeremiah Higgins to corroborate William's story. He was actually there 2 years and 11 months. When William Mariner got back to England, Jeremiah Higgins was out on duty on a ship, and then he comes back. So we're talking about almost 2 years later. They get back together, and the interesting thing that he noticed is that they started speaking Tongan to each other. So you have people who are going out and sailing and stuff, and it was just a really interesting a note that's what the language they retreated to was that language. And he said that if you were to hear them speaking in the dark, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. They spoke Tongan that well, right? John Martin gets the other 3 guys, right? It was William Mariner, Jeremiah Higgins, and another 2 guys together to show his friends, basically. So John Martin gets the William Mariner's other 3 friends to come over to tell their story and corroborate William Mariner's story. Mariner himself was adopted into the king's house. He was adopted by the king, or whoever was considered the king in Ha'apai. And his name was Finau Ulukalala. And Finau Ulukalala took Mariner in and put him under his youngest wife. Finau Ulukalala's youngest wife became William Mariner's mom in Ha'apai. That's where they lived. That's where he then became from. The other three guys were passed on into three different families, and they had different occupations. But the reason why Mariner had such an intimate detail of the Tonga history, the language, the music, the politics, and religion and everything is because he was instructed under the house of the king himself. Now, the kings, we consider kings, people who are, ordained and voted for or whatever. But in Tonga, kings were only considered that almost self-proclaimed through military combat. It wasn't. He was just the king of Hapai Vava'u and that side of Tonga. But inside, once you get inside, it was somebody else. The main thing about this preface of this story is the fact that because a lot of people ask me, why do you lean so hard on William Mariner's story and the book? Because at this point in time, we are listening to people who are telling stories from 200 years ago, and it goes into almost fictitious, mythological Polynesian stuff like the movie Moana, right? Maui and islands being pulled up by hooks and fish, guts and all this stuff, right? Which is mythological to me, which is cool. It's a fun story, but they're all bedtime stories to me. I really think that it's more beneficial for us to understand what actually happened. And this is what actually happened. So all this talk about, and we'll get into the tattooing, we'll get into the polygamy and the plural marriage and families and building of all that throughout the story. But I lean so hard on William Mariner because this is before reading and writing was even introduced to Tonga. As a matter of fact, there's an anecdote about William Mariner and his friends writing stuff to each other on the beach, and then Finau Ulukalala and all the people that were with them were amazed about with the writing, because they were writing in Tongan, and but they eventually everybody was like it blew their mind that somebody can communicate something by writing it down in words, right? That's why I'm so big on the Mariner stories, because this is before they could even read or write. So nobody could create a story except through oral history. So they're telling stories and they're passing it down and passing it on. And just like as we all know, the whole if you look at those stories where people you tell up somebody a story and then they turn around the telephone story or whatever that is, and then eventually at the very end the story changes so much to where now we believe that the oceans and the islands were pulled up by people, and people are come from gods and they fell out of the sky and stuff like that, when really no, we were all just born, right? If we're gonna talk about the actual scientific ways of how people are created and islands are created, we know it came out of the earth, lava, science, biology, and so on and so forth. And so before Tonga could even read or write, nobody was reading or writing. They actually thought it was witchcraft to write and read and write, because there were already missionaries from England in Tonga reading and writing, and they felt like because they were communicating that way and nobody else was understanding, because we're such an oral people, they thought that they were committing acts of witchcraft. So that's another reason why this part of history was so important. So when people speak of history and speak of the 1800s and the late 1800s, after Christianity showed up in the 30s and after everything happened, now the people in Tonga and pretty much Polynesia are relaying stories that they only heard orally. Nothing was recorded. And I have yet to find anything that was actually recorded as intimately detailed as William Mariner's before anybody could read and write. That's why I lean so hard on Mariner's story, because he's talking about our behavior before anybody else could talk about it. He was there. He was adopted to the leader of that island under the youngest wife, and it'll go into the story where the youngest wife will teach the culture. She'll teach whatever the father's house entails. Each mother of that man or each wife of that man will teach each of their children the principles not only of the culture but of the house of that man. And because this man was in politics and he was the leader and he was the military guy, Mariner was able to get into the details of everything, the religion and on through the culture. Jeremiah Higgins, when he got back to England, he went and started working for a man named Mr. T. Woodman, who was an intelligent farmer. John Martin said that he was very intelligent. He knew what he was talking about, whatever. And Jeremiah Higgins will tell stories about Tonga to Mr. Woodman. And when John Martin ran into Mr. Woodman, he asked Mr. Woodman what Jeremiah Higgins told him about Tonga, and gave him the original, the first edition copy of the book of William Mariner's experience to Mr. Woodman. Mr. Woodman read it and told him that's exactly how the story was relayed to him by Jeremiah Higgins himself. Even though Jeremiah Higgins was a quiet guy and really didn't say much or whatever, he did speak often. And there was a lot of people that questioned him because nobody has ran into an experiences like that, even though a lot of them have sailed, they've been to South America or the West Indies or wherever. None of them have actually come across, a story like this. So they'd always question, and some would mock and some would, not believe. But when the book came out and people started reading it, anybody who told the story, Mariner, Jeremiah Higgins and his companions, the more people that told those stories, this book basically came out and corroborated all those stories, because they know some of them weren't even believable, especially the stuff for the wars. And he does mention that they were tattooed like the Tongans were, and that tattoo ran from the belly button, basically the belly button, to the knee. Nowadays we notice and recognize that tattoo is on Samoan people, the Samoan chiefs or the Samoan high chiefs or the Samoan speaking chiefs, and that's what they use it for as far as where it's at now. Ever since Christianity showed up to Tonga, and Tonga eliminated the tattoo thing because Christianity taught that the body was a temple, Tongans stopped tattooing. Even though at that time 14, 15, 16-year-old Mariner said they were all getting tattooed just so that they could mark them as whatever tribe that they're from. They were marking the warriors accordingly. The word tatao itself means similar or looks alike or whatever. That's basically what tatao comes from. And so as the earliest spelling of the word, as far as modern history, tattoo comes from his dictionary. He made a dictionary and it comes from that dictionary, because he spelled it Tattow, tatao, as best he can pronunciate or enunciate the word tattoo, and now we use the word tattoo. Side note, the first time I ever heard that, I was watching Jeopardy. And on Jeopardy, Alex Trebek says the word tattoo comes from this small nation in the South Pacific, and I was like, it does? And then when he said, what is Tonga? Then I was like, the word tattoo comes from there. And then once I read this book and realized that he wrote a dictionary back in the early 1800s, then I realized, they're saying tatao, which means the same. That everybody they marked with these markings, they wanted to make sure that they looked alike, because the tribes were different. And in order for them to know who they're fighting and who they're going to war with, because all they had was a wrapping of cloth around their waist. Once they went to war, everybody tied their wrappings up so that the whole tattoo would show from the belly button to the knee, so that you would know who was killing who and who you were killing. That's what that marking was from, so that you all look alike. Tatao. So that's where that part of the history of the tattoo, according to Mariner, comes from. So there was no difference in the stories as as his companions told the stories wherever they told it. There was very little difference or variations as far as the behaviors of the Tongans from the Mariner's three friends, and the book itself corroborated everybody. The interesting thing about the tattoos is that the precision of the lines, or the detailed way that they made the tattoos, was interesting because it matched what Captain Cook had wrote about it earlier. So Mariner gets to Tonga in 1806, but Captain Cook had already wrote about tattoos in 1777. Like I said about John Martin, he used to be a writer of books, a writer of Savage Nations, and it was impressive to him. He couldn't have come up or made anything like this up. So as far as my weight of belief in this book, because it was Mariner and other witnesses and they told the story, because a lot of the behavior and the mannerisms of the Tongan people are in this book before writing, that's why I rely heavily on it. Modern day Tongans and Polynesians in general will still believe what the stories have been passed on orally, and that's all good and great and all, but I don't think that it's beneficial as far as anyone who's seeking truth about the behavior of Polynesia, because Mariner was there when Polynesia was still somewhat an empire, because he goes to Fiji, he goes to Samoa, he goes to Hawaii, and there's reasons and why those places are the way they are. Those places are even named the way they are, and it somehow, some way leads back into evidence of an empire in the South Pacific, and Mariner happens to be at the capital as an adopted son of the king at that time. That'll be the story that I tell here in this book. Until next time, we'll see you later, my friends.